I wanted to say hello. I wanted to say thank you to all of you, and wanted to spend some time saying thanks because you have right now. I'm sure you have you have decided to be with us in the international presentation of Few Cold Cut and Immortal Rye. We did a session in last March, last April, as far as I remember. We did a session also with our friends at Bart's. Just we tasted our whiskeys. We tasted a few bourbon and few rye, and we did a distillery visit. And it thought it was a great occasion. We thought it was a very good occasion to to host another session to launch the Immortal Rye and the and Cold Cut and share with you. The tasting and some of the views and some of what's the rationale behind it. So I'm passing it to Paul. He will be helping us and he will be hosting the distillery visit. So you can start to show a little bit of the distillery, Paul.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Salva, and really happy to be here. Really, always fantastic to work with our friends at Bart's Bottles in the UK and Maverick Bart's Bottles in the Netherlands and Maverick in the UK. And really happy to be here today. Obviously, tough times for everybody, but we're really excited to be kicking off and trying to launch the Cold Cut Bourbon and the Immortal Rye. And we're going to start off by doing kind of a quick little distillery tour and kind of talk a little bit about where we are and what we are. And we're going to conclude out with a kind of a tasting and a structured guide of both the Cold Cut as well as the Immortal. And so I think it's really important to kind of start off with, who is Few and why is Few? And, Few is created to defy traditional whiskey making rules or practices. We are very proudly non-traditional. We do not make our whiskey in Kentucky. We do not make our whiskey in Tennessee or Kentucky. We make our whiskey right here in Chicago. And what we're trying to really do is to create what we're trying to call the Chicago style of whiskey. And as part of that, we want to make sure that we're doing things a little bit different. And so part of being different is doing things in an urban environment. And when you come to visit, you might be a little bit thrown off. And I know Salva can vouch for this. I know Michael can vouch for this. Luke will eventually, hopefully. But when you come here,
we are losing you. I think you are just outside, and we are losing you. But
I think he walked out of the Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I walked out of Wi-Fi. Okay, coming back. You got me again?
Yes, we got you. So you are outside, just outside the distillery.
Yeah, so just outside the distillery, and I think it's important to kind of note that there's the street, but to find the distillery, you got to walk down an alley. Oh, geez, there goes my mask. You walk by the dumpsters, and there's a resale shop right here. But as you kind of get in here, kind of walk down the alley, you can see the train tracks right behind me. I don't want to walk into something, so I'm gonna stop walking backwards. You come in the door and you got this is our tasting room. This is where we have our public views. And I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna switch it around so you don't be looking at me. There we go, much better. And so this is kind of our tasting room. This is where the public comes in and this is where people can see. Very, very small space. And as you could probably tell, for a company that distributes across 5 continents and across 36 countries, as well as 50 states in the US, we have a pretty small area. And I'll kind of walk you through into the back here. But again, we're talking about a non-traditional whiskey. This is our production floor. You can see Jared working here. Everybody say hi to Jared.
Hey, everybody.
Or Guten Tag, if you will. But this is our production floor, and this is where we actually make all of the spirit that we sell all over the world. Here you can see some White Dog whiskey coming right off the still, as well as that's about 200 gallons of whiskey right there. What will be whiskey, at least.
Paul, can you please tell us a little bit how everything starts? Because I think it's important to share that it's from grain to glass. So we received, I'm starting to see just on the right-hand side, some of the grains we receive. And
Yep.
so how do you start the process?
So perfect segue, Salva. Thank you. And so, Salva, you're absolutely correct. We are a grain to glass distillery, and when we do our tours, just like now, we always try to make a really big deal of the fact that we are grain to glass. And you can see we've got bags and bags of grain. All this stuff over here, this is all rye. Each pallet holds about 2,000 pounds of grain, which is what we use basically every day. Our corn, we use a lot more corn, so we actually get custom branded corn made just for us. And the corn comes in, and it gets added into our mash tank, which is up over here, which is where we actually mash all of our grains. When you mash, you are basically cooking the grains and then adding malted barley in order to create sugar water or what will end up being fermented. Woohoo! Just water in there right now as we're heating it up, but there you have it. Mash tank is where you cook it. You add in the grain, you cook the grain, add in malted barley, and once the grain is cooked, you end up with a bunch of starches. Add malted barley, and the barley converts all those starches into sugars.
Okay, and what are you cooking today? What is the plan, the production plan for
today?
today?
We are cooking. Today we're making rye whiskey, so we got a little extra. We got some extra bags of rye waiting to get added in, and once it's cooked, like I said, you end up with sugars. Add in yeast, and the yeast is what's going to convert to those sugars into the alcohol that we all know and love. We've got two 30-barrel fermenters over here. This is where we could start off our cooling as well as the very beginning of the fermentation. And over in the corner, we have three 60-barrel fermenters, which is where we do most of the actual fermentation. Once the fermentation is complete, and also
How
I should
long
point
it
out
takes,
that
sorry, Paul?
Fermentation's about 3 days. We
Okay.
call mashing about a day, even though it really only takes about 6 hours. For production schedule, we basically call it a whole day.
Okay.
Over here, we have our column still, which is where we actually separate the alcohol from the grains and water. Operates best in a continuous fashion. You can sort of see so the grain kind of bubbling around back there. We do distill on the grain, as you can very clearly tell. It comes into low wines, and what happens in the column distillation is the wash comes in at the bottom, right through this pipe. It's carried all the way to the top, all the way at the top of the column. You pour it down the center of the column, where it comes down here. And at the same time, you're adding in steam from the back via a steam pipe. The steam rises, wash falls, and it flash boils the alcohol, which enters into the condenser, gets turned into low wines, this is the parrot right here. So you can see the densitometer, the hydrometer floating in there, and our low wines receiver right here, which is where we collect all of our low wines. Once the low wines are received, we're going to let it rest for a little bit, and then we're going to put it into our finishing still right over here. And so this is our finishing still, which is, I believe, running rye whiskey today as well. Now, like I showed you before, there's the White Dog rye whiskey coming off the still, nice and slow, and slowly filling up the tote for a lot of whiskey in the tote.
What would be the approximate ABV or proof we have in that inside
So
there?
right now,
Yeah,
it'll average out to about 135. Where we're at right now is about 138.
Okay.
If you can see, it's right in there, right where it's meeting. Where you go? There you go. It smells delicious too, I gotta say. God dang.
So 135
Now I
proof
kinda
is
wanna go for a bath.
approximately 68 ABV. So we are,
Yep.
And then this is the 68% ABV. This is what we will be then doing.
Yeah, so I mean that's just a spot point. So the ABV is going to fluctuate throughout the entirety of the run.
Yep.
So right now we're getting towards the higher end of it, which means that we're starting. We're not quite to where we're going to be doing our tails cut, but we are getting closer and closer.
Okay.
So that's at the high end. We'll average out to about 135, which is about 67%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that'll be the average. It's going to get blended in our blending tank for the most part overnight to allow that to allow the first part of the run and the last part of the run to equal out and to kind of marry and run together, at which point we will then barrel it into barrels such as these, which got barreled today. Yeah, today is 12/8. Yep, you can sort of see right there. Yep. And then these barrels will get carried over to our warehouse where they will wait for quite a while until they're ready to bottle. I've got six barrels over here full of water. These are just getting ready to receive the whiskey tomorrow.
Ah, interesting. And talking about the barrels, I think that this is something we all know, but it's good to remember. So we are using new charred oak barrels. Yep. This is 53 gallons. What we are seeing. Yeah,
correct. These are all 53 gallons, 220 liters. We haven't put anything into anything other than a 53-gallon, 220-liter barrel in about 2 years now.
Okay.
And so these are our barrels. It's Minnesota oak. Minnesota is a little bit farther north of us. So if those of you from Europe, most of the wood used for whiskey barrels comes from Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, Mississippi, and down that area, where it's generally relatively warm. Think about the equivalent of, say, for example, Spain or Italy as far as temperature. Minnesota, however, is much farther north, where the growing season is going to be a lot shorter. Think Norway, think Finland, think Denmark. So that terroir of the wood changes the character of the whiskey, and we're very proud to be using whiskey barrels that are a little bit different. Shorter growing season, tighter grain, changes the character of the whiskey. Any questions? Yes. I feel like I'm going pretty quick, but I know a lot of you probably saw our other presentation a couple months ago.
No, I think that overall we have been overseeing the production, the elaboration process. We have seen how we receive the grains. You said something which is relevant for what we will be talking about later, and it's about how you make things different at Few. I think that we have seen, and you have mentioned the barrels, which are first of all different. I think that also. Yep. You have like this magic formula, the 70-20-10 that you are using in general. What are you looking, and what is the objective of using a high rye bourbon and a very high rye whiskey, of course?
So when we're making our whiskeys, we're always trying to make sure that we're making them a little bit differently than everybody else. Primarily because why bother making something that somebody else is already making? They're already making it, so we're going to make something a little bit different. So, pretty early on, we decided that 70-20-10 was a great mash bill because that 70% gives you all of the large grain that you want, while 20% of the small grain is enough to have a dramatic effect on the flavor, but not dominate, and also not get drowned out by other ones. And then, of course, 10% malted barley is it's effectively required based on science. It's that barley that actually converts those sugars. It's barley that converts the starches into sugars. We were talking about mashing beforehand. So without barley, there is no fermentation. So you have to have some of that. But on top of that, that 70-20, again, it gives you this really nice balance. And so for Few bourbon, we use 70% corn, 20% rye. So lots of sweetness from that 70% corn, but you also get some really nice spice from that rye content. Flip it around, on Few rye whiskey, we use 70% rye, 20% corn. Again, gives you that great spice that you're looking for when you're talking about a rye whiskey, but 20% corn is going to give you some sweetness to make it a much more complex, full-flavored, and rich whiskey. But we're Few Spirits. We're not going to stop there. We're always going to make things just a little bit different. And so we're really fastidious and very careful and very, very focused on the yeast that we use. And so specifically when we're talking about the Few bourbon, we wanted something that was going to be a very, very spicy bourbon. So 20% rye gets us halfway there. But on top of that, we wanted to use a spicy flavored yeast. And so we actually use a yeast that originally came out of Belgium. It's basically a Belgian farmhouse indoor saison yeast. It's going to give a lot of pepper, spice, coriander, cumin, these really nice kind of spicy flavors. And that combined with that wonderful Minnesota oak barrel creates what I think is one of the spicier bourbons on the market. But again, flip that around. On the Feu Rye, we use a French wine yeast. So why do we use a wine yeast? It's to emphasize a lot of the fruitiness. So instead of Feu Rye just being nothing but spicy, you get spice, but you also get sweet. And on top of the sweet, you also get this really nice fruitiness from that wine yeast. Very different. Nothing else really quite like it on the marketplace, and something we're really proud of. And it continues to get us attention. Feu Bourbon is our #1 selling product, but Feu Rye continues. Even 8 years after it's released, it continues to generate hype, and people get excited, and people watch it and see it as a standard bearer for quality and flavor in the world of craft whiskey.
When we are at whiskey shows, which unfortunately this year hasn't been possible, but I think that one thing I like to say, and here in Europe, is that a great way to discover for malt whiskey drinkers, a good way to discover Feu is actually through Feu Rye, because it's a nice bridge for a single malt or Scotch whiskey drinkers towards American whiskeys. They will not find that sweetness that they potentially would be expecting, actually, which is good.
Yeah, for sure. And certainly it's been my experience that when somebody identifies themselves as being a Scotch drinker, Feu Rye is the fantastic way to introduce them to the world of Feu, because I think a lot of people that identify themselves as Scotch don't want that big, heavy sweetness that you can get from bourbon. And they might be a little bit put off because their previous bourbon experiences are very sweet. Now, while Feu Bourbon may not be as sweet as other ones, the introduction of Feu Rye and giving them that option to try something that isn't bourbon can be really a great way to introduce people to the universe and the world of Feu.
And also, I think that it helps talking about Feu Rye again, but it's great for bartenders, and because it gives a lot of versatility just when preparing cocktails, when mixing drinks.
Absolutely. The cocktails with Feu Rye are just absolutely fantastic. It's something it's stuff that we're really proud of. Sorry, I get the mail person's coming in. You gotta do the mask.
Yeah, sure.
Gotta be polite.
Paul, excuse me, and I have a question. How about women? Are women drinking a bourbon neat? Are they doing this? Like we women are drinking now tequila neat, not mixing? Mm-hmm. Is that happening?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing. I mean, women drink the exact same way as men do with their mouths, and so that's different women like it neat. Some women don't. Some men like it neat. Some men don't. And what I'm seeing is, first off, a massive switch in the whiskey drinker. So 10 years ago, when Feu first hit the market, it seemed like it was about 90% men drinking whiskey to about 10% women. Whereas here today in the cursed year 2020, we're not to 50-50 yet, but I want to say that we're probably sitting at maybe 70-30 and maybe 65-35, somewhere in that area, which is wonderful. I mean, whiskey doesn't have gender. Men and women both like whiskey. Now, some people are going to like it neat, some people won't. That's okay, and I think that's partially the joy of whiskey, is that you can enjoy whiskey however you like it, and there's just simply no right or wrong way to drink it. But that's the joy. Did that answer your question?
Yes, very interesting to know. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead, Salva.
I think I wanted to ask to anybody, is there any question regarding the elaboration? Is Paul and the Few Spirits team doing things differently? Because I think that if we have seen that they are doing, it's very clear that Few, it's not the traditional bourbon whiskey we think about or we are used to drink here in the European side. I think that you even push the boundaries further with your innovation. And before starting to talk about the new products and the new releases we wanted to share and we wanted to taste together, I wanted to ask you about what are the drivers for innovation? What do you think? How do you identify an opportunity and how do you experiment?
Well, I think first off, we experiment pretty wildly and pretty freely, and we're never afraid to experiment because we're not afraid to fail. If we experiment and we fail, the rest of the world doesn't see it. We'll just kind of sit behind closed doors and laugh about it. And I know, in particular, I know Michael's had a chance or the quote opportunity to taste some of our failures, and I think he'll probably agree with me that our failures tend to be pretty epically bad. But that's okay. That just means we don't sell it. And so, our inspiration for innovation can come from anywhere. It can come from, say for example, the fact that I drink enough coffee to kill a horse, i.e., what ended up turning into the Few cold cut. It can end up as inspiration from music and trying to just the idea of trying to create liquid art and put it in a bottle. It can come from observations that we see out in the world. We've innovated products based on jokes that I've made on Facebook. I think innovation kind of comes from a whole bunch of different places, and you never know where a good innovation is going to come from, and it can be really difficult to figure out a good innovation from a not so good innovation before you make it. And so we're very aggressive in experimentation and making new things. And people who come to the distillery, if we're feeling generous, we've got time, we'll sometimes open up our box of tricks where we'll have 30, 40, 50, 60 different whiskeys that we have, played around with, none of which will ever see the light of day, but they're all still kind of fun. And you can sort of watch and see development of ideas and how things kind of progress and experiment, and the differences that you can make by tweaking little ideas. And the process of taking a concept to a product has a whole bunch of curves and changes, and it very rarely ends up the way we think it's going to end up. But we're we're letting the whiskey speak for itself. We'll try something, we'll make something, and then we'll see how it is. If it's good, great. If it's not good, is there a way that we can make it better? Or is it just bad from the get-go? Was it a good idea that was poorly implemented, or was it a bad idea well implemented? And all these things can be true for various innovations. But we're really proud of, I think partially what helps us make us really proud of the innovations that do actually end up seeing the market. Our innovation started off by just having Few bourbon and 70-20-10 and a Belgian beer yeast. And, that was kind of our first level of innovation. And then we're taking that and we're iterating on that with different, playing around with different things, such as cold cut, or we've got different finishes, and we've got experiments going on right now with different wood and different finishes and different wood and different finishes. And trying to play around with all these ideas, because at the end of the day, what really matters is not, oh, that's a really cool innovation. What really matters is the whiskey in the glass, because that's the only thing that really matters. We can talk about, oh, this is really cool that we innovated this way, but if it doesn't taste good, who cares? And so our innovation is always tailored to get to what's in the glass. We may do certain things that are because it's fun or because it entertains us. As many people know, I have a raging case of ADD. And so I always need to play around to help keep myself interested to engage with my ADD. But that doesn't mean that all those innovations are going to go into a bottle.
And I think that we have mentioned two of them, but one of the whiskeys that few we have had great success in the United States, and it was part of the innovation. So we had few rye, we had few bourbon. Then you decided to have American whiskey. So this was something quite of different. And here in Europe, especially when we talk about American whiskeys, people almost, there is kind of the thinking that it's only about bourbon. So then we need to say that in bourbon it's 51% corn, etc., etc. And then innovation was also American whiskey. So you started with American whiskey was something very not that known exactly, even in the US.
Yeah, I mean, historically, just the phrase American whiskey has been a negative connotation, in particular in Europe. But it's time for that connotation to go. And I think Europeans are understanding that bourbon can be an exquisite whiskey. The world of whiskey is much larger than just Scotch. The world of whiskey is much larger than just Irish. And the fact that a whiskey is neither Scotch nor Irish does not mean that it's not good. Bourbon is a fantastic whiskey. However, the word American whiskey tends to be a little bit negative. And we're trying to change that, because American whiskey just means whiskey made in America. Just like there's bad Scotch and good Scotch, of course. There's good American whiskey and bad American whiskey. We'd like to think we've got one of the good ones, and the critical acclaim and our sales numbers would indicate that we're right. But that innovation of American whiskey is just because the whiskey in that bottle doesn't fit a class or type. It's not bourbon. It includes bourbon in there, but it's not bourbon itself. It's not rye whiskey. There's rye whiskey in there, but it's not rye whiskey. Few American, changing the screen up. Few American whiskey, it's okay, I just threw me off. Few American whiskey is a vatting of bourbon, rye, as well as a malt whiskey that we make. And so that was an innovation. You can kind of see that on that screen, kind of behind the snake bottle or the dragon bottle in front. With the American whiskey that Selva's circling, it's got this, it's got the eagle on the front, and it's delicious. And we're hoping to get that launched in Europe in the not super distant future. But on top of that, our innovations have also gone a little bit beyond that, and we started playing with what we call cuts. And so that's the Few Cold Cut as well as the Few Immortal Rye, and those are both innovations that we're really very excited about. The Few Cold Cut launched about a year ago, hit Europe over the summer, and I think it's sold out in a day, maybe two.
Almost.
Yeah, almost. Sold out quick.
Yeah.
And so based on the success of that, we're launching the Immortal Rye literally today, I believe. And so it's something that we're also very excited about and happy to be a part of a launch talking about both of these products. And so
ask something?
Yeah, please.
What's the mash bill of the American whiskey?
So the American whiskey really doesn't have a mash bill. The way we make it is a vatting of 3 different whiskeys. So it's the vatting is the Few bourbon, which is again 70-20-10. It's a vatting of Few rye, which is again 70-20-10. But then there's a third whiskey, which is only about 8% of the blend. But it's an extraordinarily smoky whiskey. And so it has a huge effect on the flavor where it really just fundamentally changes it. Now, you don't end up with Few American whiskey tasting smoky, but there's a really rich and thick smoky texture where you can feel the depth of flavor from the smoke, but not so much the flavor. So like if you're a whiskey aficionado and you're tasting it and you're going looking for smoke flavors, you're gonna find them. But if you're just casually sipping it and enjoying it, you're not gonna find smoke, but what you will find is incredible depth and richness. And it gives this texture to the spirit that I believe is just absolutely magical. But I'm not trying to avoid your question of what's the mash bill, but there is no straight answer to it. So I'm also not going to lie to you either.
So why don't we taste and we start with cold cut? As you say, we had great success with cold cut. We have now received more of the cold cut, so it's now again available. I would like to say that one of the awards that cold cut won was the 2020 World Whiskey Awards, and why don't you guide us through the tasting, please?
Oh, sure. Somebody just asked the question how we get the
Yeah.
smoky flavor in there. So
Sorry.
before I jump into cold cut, I'll answer that if that's okay.
Yes.
And so the way we do that is the same way they get smoky flavors in Scotland. We use smoked malt. Now we don't use peat smoked malt primarily because we're not actually in Scotland, and peat isn't readily available here. And so it never made sense to me to use peat smoked malt because we'd have to import it from Scotland. So why not let the Scots use that? We'll do something different. So we use cherrywood smoked malt, which is going to be a much softer, lighter, sweeter smoke. You're not going to get that kind of saline, band-aidy flavor that you would from, say, an Islay malt, but you will get this really nice smoky flavor, but not as aggressive as an Islay malt could be. That could, people that love it, people that hate it. It's a little bit kind of in the middle where you get smoky flavors and smoky texture, but not so much that band-aid saline aggression. So is that fair enough, Bart? I'll presume it is, and just kind of continue on with.
And Paul, before you go before you go into the cold cut, can you tell a little bit more about the 46.5 ABV or the 93 proof?
Absolutely.
And the Chicago sides on the bottles?
Absolutely. So all of our bottles, obviously we're in Chicago, and the 93 proof, obviously it's an American thing, not a European thing, but proof is just twice the ABV. And here in Chicago, one of the major historical events here in town was the 1893 World's Fair, which was celebrating the rebuilding of Chicago after a fire that burned most of the city to the ground. And so all of the iconography and all of our labels from the bourbon to the rye to the gins, all of the iconography on our labels is based on stuff that you would have seen for the first time at the World's Fair. And it's something that we're really proud of. Here. Hey, Jared, can you help out for a sec? Sorry, no worries. And so it's all stuff that you would have seen for the first time at the World's Fair. And 93 is kind of our continued homage to the World's Fair and being here in Chicago and being part of the community here in Chicago. So 93 proof celebrates that 1893 World's Fair, but you guys will see this 46.5, which doesn't make as much sense, but it's still part of who we are. And it ties, it really ties our whiskeys to a place in time in 1893, which was the rebirth of Chicago. Kind of in the same way we're trying to see Few as being the rebirth of the spirits industry post-prohibition in the U.S., because here in Evanston, it was the birthplace of the entire prohibition movement across the entire U.S.
And I can think about that. It's pretty hard to make every single batch and every single bottle tasting great at the 93 proof, right? It's difficult to make your, for example, your cold cut on 93 in the best possible way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly proofing is always a challenge, especially at the small scale that we operate. But we do have science. We do have science, and so that helps. So sorry.
There is an issue of water to get the right proof.
Yeah, so obviously whiskey comes out of the barrel at a certain proof or a certain ABV. For the most part, our whiskeys come out of the barrel at about 60 to 64% ABV. and we bottle them at 46.5. So, perfect segue into the cold cut and Immortal, because few bourbon and few rye and virtually every whiskey out there that I know of, in fact, every other whiskey out there that I know of, uses water to bring, the barreled whiskey down to the bottling strength, other than cask strength whiskeys. So you just add water. If it's a little bit higher on that batch, you add more water. If it's a little bit lower, you add less water. For the few cold cut, we bring, instead of using water, we use cold brew coffee. So those of you who drink coffee, in particular cold brew, know that when you make cold brew, you just soak the beans in cold water rather than hot water. It's not like espresso. It's not an Americano. You just take you take the coffee grounds and add them to water. Because it's cold, it takes a long time for the flavor to develop. It doesn't extract nearly as well at cold temperatures as it does at hot. But what it does is it also changes the way that the flavors get extracted from the coffee beans. So hot coffee, you get some bitterness, you get some astringency, you get that coffee flavor that people know and love. When you use cold brew, however, you still get some of those same flavors, but you don't get nearly as much bitterness. It really brings out the chocolatey and sweet flavors from the coffee bean. Cocoa, coffee, caramel, all of which are in coffee normally, but the bitterness and astringency from the hot extraction can kind of cover them up a little bit. By using cold brew, it really allows the sweetness of the coffee bean to shine through. Now, it takes a little bit longer to make cold brew coffee than it does hot coffee, but I'm in the whiskey business. A day doesn't really faze me. It doesn't. That's pretty quick to us, and so we don't worry about it taking a little bit longer. We worry about the flavors that we get, and it works really, really well because the sweetness and the chocolatey of the coffee plays with the sweetness and the spice and the frankly the ABV of the bourbon, and you get this magical beverage where you get the whiskey flavors and you get the coffee flavors, and they're both coming together and also alternating in what's coming forward and what's at the forefront and what's at the back. And so for me, when I drink it, the first taste is almost always pure whiskey. You get a little bit of coffee flavor here, a little bit of coffee there. But to me, the first sip of cold cut is few bourbon. Second sip, that coffee starts to come really far, starts to really eke in. You get, oh, there's that chocolate he was talking about. There's the caramel. There's that sweetness. The third sip, almost all coffee. You get the wonderful cold brew flavors with some kind of bourbon subtleties behind it. And it all just kind of ebbs and it flows and it changes with each successive sip. But it's different. And, there's no sugar added. This is not a coffee liqueur. This is, it's 46.5%. It's real whiskey. There's no flavorings. There's no colorants. There's nothing added. It's just whiskey and just coffee. And you end up with something that in the glass that's very different. And like Salvo was showing earlier, just one world's best flavored whiskey, which it really isn't a flavored whiskey. But when it gets called the world's best, I don't fight with people on that one.
And if you... Sorry, please go ahead, Magnolia.
I have another question, Paul.
Please.
If we visit few distillery, will we see the process happening? Because, I was a little disappointed when I visited, some wineries or, Talisker distillery in Scotland, and the process was not happening. And I am familiar here in Mexico with even though we have the agave plant every 8 or 7 years. If we go to a distillery, every week we can see the process happening, and not only machinery, the nice stills, the nice fermentation tanks. So how is it in few house?
So currently, because of COVID, we're not really having visitors, but historically and in the future, we're hoping to be able to reopen. And yes, you can see the process is happening. Because of where we are, we're actually spread out across a bunch of different buildings that are pretty far apart. So you won't be able to see everything happening, but you'll be able to see the mashing, and you'll see the fermentation, and you'll see the stills, and you'll see some barrels. You won't see the barrel warehouse because we don't really disclose where that is because it's got 9,000 barrels of whiskey in it. But I mean, you as a VIP, or if there are VIPs coming, then we can show them. But it's a mile and a half away, so it's not like you can just walk over. You have to jump in a car and you have to drive over. And then our bottling's at a different facility, so you got to get in a car again and drive over to the bottling facility. So you could see everything, but depending on what everything means to you, it doesn't all happen right here. It does all happen in our buildings. We do everything. Once we receive the grain, we do everything until it goes into a bottle, and we ship out we ship out bottles. So grain comes into the box of the distillery, and bottles of whiskey go out. Does that make sense?
Sounds like a nice weekend to me.
It's not so bad.
And talking about the iconography, we're talking about the Chicago Expo and exhibition, and so you are there in the cold cut bottle. There's also some iconography. So could you please explain us a little bit more about?
Sure. So the iconography on the cold cut bottle is basically a coffee roaster that was at the World's Fair. So people had seen coffee roasters before, so it wasn't really like the brand new scientific invention that was wowing the world, because people have been roasting coffee before, of course. But we're trying to figure out a way to convey coffee, but also have a cool visual, and also tie it to the World's Fair.
And if you can guide us and disclose a little bit more, talking about coffee, and one question I'm receiving more often is about how much caffeine does it have. So do we? It's high on, so it has a big percentage of caffeine, or more or less. What can you tell us about?
So the entire bottle, the 750 milliliter or 700 milliliter for you guys, it's got about a cup and a half of coffee. So now we're not talking about the Starbucks Grande American, the big cups. We're talking about what you might serve, what a real person would drink. Coffee cup that's the size of a coffee cup.
Okay.
But it's so, in other words, or another way to think about it is the whiskey going in here is about 60% before you add the coffee, and it's 46.5%. So it's about 70 to 80 milliliters of coffee in the bottle as a whole.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. It's good to know.
Just a quick question, Paul. How is it with the regulations on still call it a bourbon when you add something else than water, just water?
Yeah, so we don't really call it bourbon. It's a bourbon whiskey with cold brew coffee. So as far as the regulations go, there is no problem because it really isn't bourbon anymore. It's bourbon with cold brew coffee. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. Thanks.
Yeah. And say, in the exact same with the 8 Immortals that we'll talk to, or the Immortal Rye that we'll get to in a second. It's about 70 to 80 milliliters of tea in the bottle. And there is caffeine in there, but we get a lot of people who are concerned about drinking the cold cut because they're afraid of all the caffeine in it. And I'm always like, well, I mean, yes, I understand where you're coming from, but if you drink enough of the cold cut that you have to worry about the caffeine, you've had an entire bottle of whiskey, and I think that's a little bit more to be concerned about than a little bit of caffeine. Don't drink a whole bottle of whiskey. That's the caffeine's the least of your issues. If you just have one or two,
at least not in once, right?
Right. Yeah, drink the whole bottle, but not in one sitting, and buy more bottles.
And before we move to Immortals, I think another question I have been asked, it's about why have you chosen coffee and bourbon, and why have you chosen rye and tea? Is there what did you find, and why have you made that match actually?
So bourbon and coffee are just a natural mix.
Okay.
And so that was relatively easy. And then we were making, the Immortal with the tea. We didn't want to just do another bourbon with coffee. We didn't do rye with coffee because that's not interesting. And we also found that the tea with the rye, it worked really well. In particular, the tea was bringing us a lot of really nice tannic backbone, and it played really well with the spice of the rye. Also, we're kind of jumping the gun here, but the Immortal tea, the tea we use in the Immortal Rye is called 8 Immortals, and it's an extremely fruity tea. And so that fruitiness really paired really nice with the spiciness of the rye, whereas the fruitiness I felt would make a bourbon too sweet, or at least perceived too sweet. Yes, fruity and sweet are different flavors, but they can get a little bit conflated in the palate. And so having a relatively or sweeter whiskey like a bourbon with a really fruity tea, it wasn't balanced. And again, we're always looking for what's in the glass, and balance is key to that. So having the spicy rye whiskey with a slightly fruity note, it just made more sense.
Okay. So let's taste it.
Cheers. So cold
Cheers.
cut, again, don't sip it just once, to have a small sip, try a couple sips, try 3, 4, 5 sips, and watch as it kind of plays around on the palate. I think it's really interesting and really cool. And it's different and it's delicious. And once you've had it out, you're not going to forget it.
I see you have another bottle here, Paul. Instead of the neck is bigger and the stopper is bigger. Is that changing for the whole line, or?
Yes.
Oh, the bottle, yes.
On the bottle, yeah.
Yes. Yep. So we recently switched over to custom glass. Our bottles used to be stock bottles from a glass manufacturer. We changed over to be all custom glass. So it's now no other brand will have this bottle. It's got a little bit of a shorter neck, a little bit wider. It's got a thicker T-top on it. And it's all American-made glass. So 2 big things. One, it's American-made, which is cool because everybody likes their stuff here. But 2, it slashed our ecological footprint. 1, the glass is coming from about a 4-hour drive away instead of coming from South America. So just the fuel involved in getting the bottles to us is, it's probably something like 3 or 4% of the fuel cost. B, we worked with our manufacturer, and instead of having all of the bottles be separated by cardboard and be wrapped to the gills in cardboard, we got rid of about 90% of the cardboard on the glass shipments. So A, it's a shorter distance, which saves fuel and greenhouse emissions and all that. B, the pallets don't come as far. So every aspect of that supply chain got shrunk. And in particular, getting rid of all that cardboard usage, that's major. I mean, yes, we recycle all of our cardboard, and that's great. But what's even better than recycling is not using it in the first place.
Well done, man. Great.
So in terms of availability, we are going the first few expressions you will see that new bottle is going to be in cold cut and in Immortal Rye, and we will progressively start to see it in the rest of the range for sure. So that's the plan, and that's what we are planning to do. We got a question from Bart. He was asking about the tea used in the Immortal Rye.
Absolutely. So it's probably a good transition to move into more of a discussion on the Immortal Rye, or should I hold that until we move over?
No, let's do it. Let's move and let's. I think we have tasted Cold Cut, so now let's taste and let's talk about a little bit more about Immortal.
Cool. So, Immortal Rye, it's the same basic concept as the Cold Cut. We use cold extracted tea rather than coffee, and so the mental framework is the same: a non-traditional liquid to bring down to proof. That's it's a similar idea, but the expression and the way it works is going to be a little bit different. So the tea we use is called 8 Immortals, and it's a black oolong tea, partially fermented from the Dankong region in China. It's grown at 2,000 feet high, 2,000 feet of elevation, and basically that's kind of the promise on it, is this balanced black oolong tea with really strong fruit notes. And by using the cold extraction, we really emphasize those fruity notes as well. And so we talked earlier very quickly about Feu Rye and the wine yeast bringing out fruit flavors. The fruit flavors in Feu Rye are pears and plums, tart cherries, whereas the fruit flavors in the 8 Immortals tea are mango, peach, honey, dragon fruit, like the dragon on the label. These really kind of more tropical style fruits than stone fruits. And they really come together to emphasize the fruitiness of the whiskey, and it really stands out. So we get all of our tea from a tea supplier in Denver. And the owner over there knows, she's forgotten more about tea than I'll ever know. So when we start talking about tea, I really quickly get over my skis, and I don't know that much about tea. But that's, if that didn't answer the question, I hope it answered the question. Bart?
Yeah, definitely yes.
Yeah, good.
I also think that it also plays very well with this.
Oh,
with
thanks.
this
Sorry,
No
I was
worries.
looking for the mute button. But I found
No worries.
Good. Magnolia was asking about how do we compare it to other bourbons. We have already mentioned that it's different. Kentucky bourbons are great. So you are at Feu, you are doing things differently. So that's the whole balance, and that's the whole thing.
For bourbon, we tend to say that no, it doesn't taste like Kentucky bourbon because it's not.
Yeah.
And specifically, we try to be really on the spicier side of bourbon. And in particular, we go for kind of a cinnamon spice rather than just we're not trying to get this big black pepper blast. We're going to go for some black pepper, but also some more on the cinnamon side. So not like the candy cinnamon, but the kind of spicy cinnamon.
Yeah. Good. I think we have covered everything we wanted to cover today. So we wanted to taste with you. I don't know if you guys have any other question, or it just we have spent the last hour together, and let's any other question, any question you have for Paul you want to know? Good. So I think it's
I've got one more question, Salva, for Paul.
Please go ahead.
Are there any other expressions in your head right now? Is there something else to expect in the next year, by any chance?
I think we're always really trying to do cool stuff. We are currently planning another rock band collaboration, which I'm really excited about. I'm not sure how much of that will hit Europe, if any, but at least 3 of the people on this call might have something to say about that. And so, we'll see how that happens. Certainly, we're really excited about the whiskey we developed. It's a really, really tasty whiskey that's very different than anything we've had before. And so I definitely know that there are a number of whiskey drinkers all over the continent that would be very excited to have a chance to try it. The whiskey by no means relies on the band to be interesting. The whiskey stands on its own, which is obviously important. But it's delicious, and we'll have to wait and see how much makes it over the pond.
Great,
Yeah,
man. I'm looking forward to it.
That's a good question. Let me just add to what Paul said, that we have other ideas and other programs that we hopefully we will be launching in during 2021. So that's we have some things going on behind the scenes, and we hope to be able to share it with you sooner rather than later. So definitely yes. But right now I think we have good. We need to focus and concentrate on this, on exploring and discovering Cold Cut and Immortal Rye, and then during 2021 for sure we will have some new things happening. I would say that potentially around summertime or just after summer we will be able to share with you some good news. And for sure I'm counting on you, Paul, to help us to discover that and to guide us through the tasting. For sure, it's always great to have you. And I wanted
we'll
to
definitely
thank
do this
you.
again. Thanks for having me on, Salva. Thanks everybody over at Bart's Bottles. Thanks to everybody over at Maverick. We appreciate all you guys do. We're always available. If we could ever answer any questions, be of any help, we're here to help you guys out. We're always doing our best to try to make sure that we're doing all we can. But again, it's always the whiskey in the glass that matters.
I agree. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
So cheers. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.